Venezuela raises the stakes and the U.S. is forced to rethink. Let me take you back to March 26 of this year. That was the day Venezuela's National Electoral Council announced that Nicolas Maduro's government had collected the required signatures to trigger a referendum on annexing a massive swath of neighboring Guyana, specifically, the Essequibo region, an area roughly the size of Florida that makes up 2/3 of Guyana's territory. Now, on the surface, this might look like just another flare-up in a long-running territorial dispute, one of those obscure conflicts that occasionally makes the news before fading back into the background. But if you've been following my work for any length of time, you know I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to geopolitics. And this? This is no coincidence. This is a calculated move, one that forces the United States to confront a reality it has spent the last 2 decades trying to. The era of unchallenged American hegemony in Latin America is over. I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of U.S. influence in its own backyard. And what's unfolding right now in Venezuela isn't just about oil, or borders, or even Maduro's desperate bid to cling to power. It's about something far. The moment when Washington finally realizes that the rules of the game have changed, and that the old playbook, sanctions, regime change rhetoric, the occasional military flex, no longer works the way it used to. The question now is whether the U.S. will adapt, or whether it will double down on a strategy that has already failed. Let's start with the official narrative, the one you've probably heard in the headlines. The story goes something like Venezuela, a rogue state run by an authoritarian strongman, is once again making reckless threats against its neighbors. Maduro, facing economic collapse and international isolation, is manufacturing a crisis to distract from his domestic failures. The Essequibo dispute, we're told, is a legal and historical matter, one that Guyana, with the backing of the U.S. and its allies, is right to defend. The Biden administration has responded with a show of joint military exercises with Guyana, increased naval patrols in the Caribbean, and stern warnings that any Venezuelan aggression will be met with a swift and severe response. The message is the U.S. stands with its democratic partners, and Venezuela's provocations will not be tolerated. There's just one problem with this: it's incomplete. And in geopolitics, what you leave out is often more important than what you include. Let me tell you what's really going on here. First, the timing. Venezuela's push on Essequibo didn't come out of nowhere. It followed Guyana's announcement in 2015 that ExxonMobil had discovered massive offshore oil reserves in the disputed waters, reserves that are now estimated to hold more than 11 billion barrels of oil, making Guyana one of the world's fastest-growing oil producers. Since then, Guyana has become a darling of Western energy commies, with Exxon, Hess, and CNOOC all pouring billions into exploration. Venezuela, meanwhile, has seen its own oil production collapse under U.S. sanctions, from over 3 million barrels a day in the 1990s to barely 700,000 today. So when Maduro talks about Essequibo, he's not just posturing. He's making it strategic. If Venezuela can't exploit its own oil, it will do everything in its power to prevent Guyana from exploiting its oil, especially when that oil is in a region Venezuela has claimed for over a century. But here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. response to this crisis isn't just about defending Guyana. It's about defending a much larger strategic, keeping China and Russia out of America's traditional sphere of influence. Because while the Western media has focused on Exxon's role in Guyana, what they've largely ignored is the growing presence of Chinese and Russian energy commies in the region. China's CNOOC is already a major player in Guyana's oil sector, and Russia's Rosneft has been quietly extending its footprint in Venezuela, trading oil for debt relief and political support. This isn't just about energy, it's about control. And for the U.S., the idea of a Chinese or Russian naval base in the Caribbean, or a military alliance between Venezuela and Moscow, is a nightmare scenario. Now, I'm not saying Maduro is some kind of geopolitical mastermind. He's not. He's a desperate leader clinging to power in a country that has been economically and socially devastated by years of mismanagement, corruption, and U.S. sanctions. But what he is doing is exploiting a fundamental weakness in U.S. The assumption that Latin America is still America's backyard, and that Washington can dictate the rules of the game indefinitely. That assumption is no longer true. And the more the U.S. tries to enforce it, the more it risks overreach. Consider the broader context over the last decade, we've seen a steady erosion of U.S. influence in Latin America. Leftist governments have taken power in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina. China has become the region's top trading partner, investing billions in infrastructure, energy, and mining. Russia has deepened its ties with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, supplying weapons, intelligence support, and diplomatic cover at the UN. And now, with the war in Ukraine draining U.S. resources and attention, the Biden administration is struggling to maintain its dominance in a region that is increasingly looking to Beijing and Moscow for alternatives. This is where the Essequibo crisis becomes a microcosm of a much larger struggle. The U.S. is trying to maintain a unipolar world order in a region that is rapidly moving toward multipolarity. And it's doing so with a toolkit that is increasingly ineffective. Sanctions? Venezuela's economy is already in tatters, and Maduro has survived worse. Military threats? The U.S. has been saber-rattling in Latin America for decades, but short of a full-scale invasion, which no one in Washington wants, there's little it can do to force Maduro's hand. Diplomacy? The U.S. has burned too many bridges with Venezuela to be an honest broker. So what's really happening here? The U.S. is being forced to confront a painful its strategy of isolating and pressuring Venezuela has failed. And now, with Guyana's oil wealth at stake and China and Russia circling, Washington is running out of options. The question is whether it will recognize this reality and adjust its approach, or whether it will double down on a losing strategy with all the risks that entails. Let's talk about those risks. Because if you think this is just about a territorial dispute, you're missing the bigger picture. The Essequibo crisis is a test case for how the U.S. will respond to the new geopolitical reality in Latin America. And right now, the signals are not encouraging. First, there's the military dimension. The U.S. has already deployed additional naval assets to the region, including the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, which conducted joint exercises with the Guyanese military in December. The Pentagon has also stepped up intelligence sharing with Guyana, and there are reports that the U.S. is considering pre-positioning military equipment in the country. Now, on the surface, this looks like a standard show of force, a way to deter Venezuelan aggression. But here's the military deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to use force. And after Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, no one, not Maduro, not Putin, not Xi, believes the U.S. has the stomach for another prolonged conflict. I've studied military interventions for decades, and I can tell you the U.S. has a long history of underestimating the costs of war in Latin America. The Bay of Pigs, the Contra War in Nicaragua, the invasion of AMA, all of these were sold as quick, surgical operations. All of them turned into quagmires. And yet, here we are again, with hawks in Washington talking about limited strikes and targeted operations as if they've learned nothing from history. Let me be: if the U.S. gets dragged into a military confrontation with Venezuela, it will not be quick, it will not be clean, and it will not end the way Washington hopes. Venezuela has one of the most battle-hardened militaries in the region, with decades of experience in asymmetric warfare. And if the U.S. escalates, you can bet that Russia and China will respond, not directly, but by ramping up their support for Maduro, turning Venezuela into a proxy battleground. Then there's the domestic political dimension. The Biden administration is facing a tough re-election campaign, and Venezuela has become a political football. Republicans are already accusing Biden of being soft on Maduro, while progressives are pushing for a more diplomatic approach. The result? A policy that is neither fish nor fowl, tough rhetoric paired with half measures that do little to change the status quo. This is a classic case of domestic politics distorting foreign policy. The U.S. can't afford to look weak on Venezuela, but it also can't afford another foreign policy disaster. So it's stuck in a holding pattern, hoping the problem will go away on its own. But here's the: problems like this don't go away. They fester. And the longer the U.S. delays a real strategy, the worse the outcome will be. So what are the possible scenarios? Let's break them down. Scenario: the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, the U.S. and Venezuela reach a face-saving agreement that defuses the crisis. Maybe Maduro agrees to drop the referendum in exchange for sanctions relief. Maybe Guyana agrees to some form of resource sharing with Venezuela. Maybe the U.S. quietly signals that it won't oppose a negotiated settlement. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Why? Because neither side has an incentive to back down. Maduro needs the Essequibo issue to rally domestic support, and the US can't afford to look like it's rewarding his aggression. Still, stranger things have happened in diplomacy. If cooler heads prevail, this could be the outcome. Scenario: the frozen conflict. This is the most likely scenario, and it's the one we've seen play out in places like Ukraine, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. The crisis doesn't escalate into war, but it doesn't get resolved either. Venezuela keeps up the pressure with low-level provocations, military exercises near the border, cyber attacks on Guyanese infrastructure, diplomatic campaigns at the UN. The US responds with more sanctions, more military aid to Guyana, and more rhetoric about defending democracy. Meanwhile, China and Russia continue to deepen their ties with Venezuela, turning the country into a permanent thorn in Washington's side. This is the new normal, a simmering conflict that never quite boils over, but never goes away either. Scenario: the escalation spiral. This is the nightmare scenario. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Chinese support, makes a move on Essequibo, maybe a limited incursion, maybe a blockade of Guyanese oil shipments. The US responds with airstrikes or a naval blockade. Venezuela retaliates by targeting US interests in the region, or by allowing Russian or Iranian forces to operate from its territory. Before long, you have a full-blown crisis, with the risk of direct US-Russia or US-China confrontation. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night, because once the shooting starts, there's no going back. Now, let me be: none of these scenarios are good. Even the best-case outcome leaves Venezuela as a failed state and Guyana as a pawn in a larger geopolitical struggle. The worst-case scenario could plunge the region into war. But here's the US has the power to shape which scenario plays out. The question is whether it has the wisdom to choose the right path. So what should the US do? Let me tell you what I've been arguing for: it's time for a fundamental rethink of American strategy in Latin America. The era of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can and should shape the world in its image, is over. It's time to return to a more realistic, more sustainable great power management. Here's what that looks like. First, the US needs to accept that it can't dictate outcomes in Latin America anymore. That means no more regime change fantasies, no more economic warfare that only hurts ordinary people, and no more military interventions that end in disaster. Second, the US needs to engage with Venezuela not because Maduro is a good guy, but because isolation has failed. Sanctions haven't toppled his regime, and they've only pushed him closer to Russia and China. A negotiated settlement, one that offers sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms and a resolution of the Essequibo dispute, is the only way forward. Third, the US needs to recognize that China and Russia are here to stay in Latin America. That doesn't mean the US should surrender the region to them. But it does mean competing in a way that doesn't alienate the very countries Washington is trying to win over. That means more trade, more investment, and more diplomacy, and less bluster. Finally, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as a monolith. The region is diverse, with different countries pursuing different interests. The US should work with those countries that share its values, but it should also accept that others will chart their own course. That's not weakness, it's realism. Now, I know what some of you are: this is surrender. This is appeasement. But let me ask you, what's the alternative? Another decade of failed policies that leave Venezuela in ruins and the US bogged down in yet another unwinnable conflict? That's not strength. That's stubbornness. The truth is, the US is at a crossroads. It can continue down the path of liberal hegemony, trying to maintain a global order that is no longer sustainable. Or it can adapt to the new reality, accepting that the world is becoming multipolar and that America's role in it must change. The choice is clear. The question is whether Washington has the humility to make it. Let me leave you with this. I've spent my career studying the rise and fall of great powers. And one thing I've learned is that the most dangerous moment for any empire is when it realizes its dominance is slipping but refuses to accept it. That's where the US is today. Venezuela's move on Essequibo isn't just a challenge to Guyana. It's a challenge to the entire post-Cold War order. And how the US responds will determine whether it can navigate this new era or whether it will stumble into a conflict it can't win. The stakes couldn't be higher. And the time to rethink is now. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's gambit isn't just about Guyana, it's about the entire architecture of US power in Latin America. And if Washington doesn't grasp that, it's going to make the same mistakes it's been making for decades. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines. First, there's the military dimension. The US has spent the last 30 years treating Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where it could afford to outsource security to local proxies or rely on economic coercion rather than direct engagement. But Venezuela's mobilization isn't just posturing. When Maduro sent 5,600 troops to the Essequibo border in April 2024, he wasn't just flexing, he was testing. Testing whether the US would respond, testing whether Guyana's military could hold the line, and, most importantly, testing whether the region's other players would fall in line or stay neutral. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no credible military option here. Not without escalating into a full-blown regional conflict. The last time the US tried regime change in Venezuela, in 2019, it ended in humiliation. The so-called humanitarian aid stunt at the Colombian border collapsed when the trucks never crossed. The coup attempt by Juan Guaidó fizzled out within months. And the sanctions? They've only strengthened Maduro's grip on power while crippling the economy. So what's left? Airstrikes? A naval blockade? That's not how you win in the 21st century. That's how you lose. And let's not forget the broader strategic picture. The U.S. Southern Command has been warning for years about the growing influence of China and Russia in Latin America. But instead of treating this as a long-term challenge, Washington has oscillated between indifference and ice. In 2023, China surpassed the U.S. as the largest trading partner for most of South America. Russia, meanwhile, has been deepening its military ties with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, three countries that have been in Washington's crosshairs for decades. When Maduro announced joint military exercises with Russia in the Caribbean in 2022, the U.S. response was a strongly worded statement. That's not deterrence. That's an invitation. Now, some in the Pentagon will argue that the U.S. can still project power in the region. And they're not entirely wrong. The U.S. still has a network of bases, from Guantanamo in Cuba to Pomarola in Honduras. It still conducts joint exercises with Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. But here's those partnerships are fraying. Brazil, under Lula, has been increasingly assertive in pushing back against U.S. influence. Colombia, once Washington's closest ally in the region, has been drifting toward a more independent foreign policy under Petro. And even Mexico, which has historically been a key U.S. partner, has been cozying up to China on trade and infrastructure projects. So where does that leave the U.S.? With a choice. It can either double down on the old playbook, sanctions, threats, and regime change fantasies, or it can accept that Latin America is no longer a backyard to be managed, but a region of sovereign states with their own interests. And if the U.S. wants to remain relevant, it's going to have to compete not just militarily, but economically and diplomatically. Let me give you an example. In 2023, China announced a $250 billion investment plan for Latin America over the next decade. That's not just money, it's influence. It's roads, ports, and 5G networks. It's loans that don't come with the kind of political strings the U.S. attaches to its aid. And it's a model that's resonating with countries tired of being treated as pawns in a great power game. The U.S., by contrast, has been cutting its foreign aid budget and imposing sanctions that hurt ordinary people more than the regimes they're supposed to target. That's not a strategy. That's a surrender. Now, I know what some of you are, but what about democracy? What about human rights? And those are valid concerns. But here's the: you don't promote democracy by starving a country into submission. You don't defend human rights by backing coups that fail and leave the country worse off. The U.S. has to learn that its moral authority in the region is not what it once was. And if it wants to regain it, it's going to have to lead by example, not by force. So where does that leave us with Venezuela? The U.S. needs to recognize that Maduro isn't going anywhere. Not in the short term, at least. And if Washington wants to counterbalance China and Russia in the region, it's going to have to engage with Caracas not as a pariah, but as a sovereign state with its own interests. That doesn't mean lifting all sanctions tomorrow. But it does mean being open to negotiations, to trade-offs, and to a more nuanced approach than the one we've seen so far. And let's not forget the bigger picture. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about oil or territory. It's about the future of the international order. If Venezuela can redraw borders through force and get away with it, what's to stop other countries from doing the same? That's why the US can't afford to ignore this crisis. But it also can't afford to overreact. The key is to find a way to deter further aggression without escalating into a conflict that nobody wants. Here's the bottom: the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon in Latin America. And if it wants to remain a player in the region, it's going to have to adapt. That means accepting that some countries will align with China or Russia. That means engaging with governments it doesn't like. And that means recognizing that the old tools of US power, sanctions, threats, and military force are no longer as effective as they once were. The question is whether Washington has the humility to accept that reality. Because if it doesn't, it's not just Venezuela that will pay the price. It's the entire region. And ultimately, it's the US itself. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy challenge for the US, it's a domestic political minefield. And that's where things get really interesting. Because while the Biden administration is trying to thread the needle between deterring Maduro and avoiding another failed regime change operation, they're also navigating a deeply polarized American electorate where Venezuela has become a partisan football. The right sees Maduro as a socialist boogeyman, a living testament to the dangers of leftist governance, while the left, at least the progressive wing, views US policy toward Venezuela as a moral stain, a relic of imperial overreach that has done nothing but immiserate millions. Neither side is wrong, exactly, but neither side is entirely right either. And that's the problem with binary thinking in foreign: it leaves no room for nuance, no space for the kind of pragmatic engagement that might actually move the needle. Let me explain why this matters. The 2024 US election is shaping up to be a referendum on Biden's foreign policy, and Venezuela is a microcosm of the broader debate. Take the recent decision to reimpose some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector after Maduro backtracked on election promises. On the surface, it looks like a measured response, tough but not punitive, a way to signal disapproval without cutting off all diplomatic channels. But dig a little deeper, and you see the political calculations at play. The White House is walking, and they can't afford to look soft on Maduro, not with Trump and the GOP hammering them on weakness in the hemisphere, but they also can't afford to double down on a failed strategy that has already cost them credibility with Latin American allies. The result? A policy that satisfies no one. Progressives call it a betrayal of the administration's own rhetoric about a new approach to Latin America, while conservatives dismiss it as half measures that won't stop Maduro's authoritarian slide. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is trapped by its own history in Venezuela. Every time Washington tries to pivot, it runs into the ghosts of past interventions. Remember 2019, when the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president? That wasn't just a policy decision, it was a performative act, a way to signal to the world that the US still called the shots in its backyard. But it backfired spectacularly. Guaidó's parallel government collapsed, Maduro consolidated power, and the US was left looking like a paper tiger. The lesson? You can't will a government into existence, no matter how much you want it to be true. And yet, here we are again, with the Biden administration flirting with the same kind of wishful thinking, hoping that targeted sanctions and diplomatic pressure will somehow produce a different outcome. But let's talk about the domestic side of this equation, because that's where the real drama is unfolding. Maduro isn't just playing geopolitical chess with the US, he's also playing a high-stakes game of survival at home. And that's something the establishment narrative often misses. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that Maduro is a weak leader, propped up by repression and Russian and Chinese support. But that's a simplistic read. The reality is that Maduro has managed to outmaneuver his opponents at every turn, not just because he's ruthless, but because he's a master of Venezuela's fractured political landscape. He's survived hyperinflation, mass protests, a US-backed coup attempt, and even a demic. That's not luck, that's political acumen. Now, consider the upcoming 2024 Venezuelan elections. Or rather, the non-elections, because no one expects them to be free or fair. Maduro has already barred Maria Corina Machado, the opposition's most popular candidate, from running. He's arrested or exiled other opposition figures. He's used the state's vast resources to tilt the playing field in his favor. And yet, the US and its allies are still clinging to the idea that these elections could somehow be a turning point. Why? Because the alternative, admitting that Maduro has no intention of relinquishing power, is too uncomfortable. It forces Washington to confront the fact that its Venezuela policy has been a failure for over a decade. Here's where the scenario projections get really interesting. If Maduro rigs the election and the US responds with more sanctions, what happens next? The most likely outcome is a continuation of the status. Venezuela remains isolated, its economy stagnates, and the regime survives by leaning on its few remaining allies. But there's a darker possibility, too. If the US doubles down on pressure, Maduro could escalate either by cracking down harder on dissent or by making a play for Essequibo, knowing that the US is distracted by its own election. Neither scenario is good for Venezuela's people, who have already suffered enough. But there's another path, one that Washington seems reluctant to take. What if the US accepted that Maduro isn't going anywhere and focused instead on managing the relationship rather than trying to overthrow him? That doesn't mean legitimizing his regime or ignoring his abuses. It means recognizing that engagement, even with unsavory actors, can sometimes yield better results than isolation. Look at the US spent decades trying to isolate the Islamic Republic, only to realize that the only way to curb its nuclear ambitions was through diplomacy. The same logic applies to Venezuela. If the US wants to counter China and Russia in the region, it needs to offer Caracas an alternative, not as a reward for good behavior, but as a pragmatic trade-off. Of course, this is easier said than done. The political costs of engaging with Maduro are high, especially in an election year. But the costs of not engaging could be even higher. If the US continues to treat Venezuela as a pariah, it risks pushing Maduro further into the arms of Beijing and Moscow. And that's a scenario that serves no one's interests except, perhaps, the autocrats in Moscow and Beijing, who are all too happy to see the US tied up in knots over a country that, in the grand scheme of things, is a second-tier player. So where does that leave us? With a choice, really. The US can continue down the path of confrontation, hoping that this time will be different, that this time the sanctions will work, that this time the opposition will prevail. Or it can accept that the old playbook is broken and try something new. That doesn't mean surrendering to Maduro. It means recognizing that the world has changed, that US power isn't what it used to be, and that sometimes the best way to advance your interests is to talk to your adversaries, not because you like them, but because you have no other choice. The question is whether Washington has the political courage to make that choice. Because if it doesn't, the only winners will be the ones who benefit from chaos, and that's a list that doesn't include the Venezuelan people, the US, or anyone else who wants to see a stable, prosperous Latin America. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader erosion of US influence in what was once its undisputed backyard. Latin America has always been a testing ground for American power, from the Monroe Doctrine to the Cold War, but today the region is slipping through Washington's fingers like sand. The numbers tell in 2000, the US accounted for 55% of Latin America's total trade. By 2022, that figure had fallen to 38%, while China's share surged from 2% to 15%. And it's not just trade. Beijing has become the largest creditor to countries like Ecuador and Argentina, while Russia has deepened its military and intelligence ties with Nicaragua and Cuba. Venezuela is just the most acute example of this shift, but it's part of a pattern, one that Washington has been slow to recognize, let alone counter. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is still operating with a Cold War playbook in a multipolar world. The assumption that economic pressure alone can force regime change is a relic of the 1990s, when the US was the sole superpower and sanctions were a blunt but effective tool. But today, Maduro has options. He can turn to China for oil-backed loans, to Russia for arms and diplomatic cover, and to Iran for sanctions-busting expertise. The US can tighten the screws, but it can't starve Venezuela into submission, not when its adversaries are willing to keep the regime afloat. And that's the real Washington is still thinking in binary terms: either Maduro goes, or we're stuck with him, when the reality is far more complex. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. If the US can't manage a crisis in its own hemisphere, what does that say about its ability to compete globally? The Biden administration has made great power competition with China its top priority, but if it can't even prevent Beijing from making inroads in Latin America, how credible is its pivot to Asia? The region is a case study in how the US is losing ground, not because of a lack of resources, but because of a failure of imagination. The old tools, sanctions, isolation, regime change rhetoric aren't working, but Washington keeps reaching for them anyway, like a doctor prescribing the same medicine for a disease that's evolved. So what are the alternatives? The first step is to stop treating Venezuela as a morality play and start treating it as a geopolitical problem. That means engaging with Maduro not out of sympathy, but out of necessity. The US could start by offering sanctions relief in exchange for concrete concessions, free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, or even just a commitment to stop selling oil to China at discounted rates. It's not about rewarding Maduro, it's about creating leverage. The goal isn't to make him a US ally, but to prevent him from becoming a full-fledged Chinese or Russian proxy. The second alternative is to rethink the role of the Venezuelan opposition. For years, Washington has pinned its hopes on figures like Juan Guaidó, only to watch as they've been outmaneuvered by Maduro's repression and their own internal divisions. The opposition isn't irrelevant, but it's not a silver bullet either. The US needs to stop treating it as a monolith and start working with the factions that are willing to engage in realpolitik, even if that means dealing with figures who aren't perfect Democrats. After all, the US has a long history of backing imperfect allies when it suits its interests, from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan. Why should Venezuela be any different? The third alternative is to address the root causes of Venezuela's corruption, economic mismanagement, and the collapse of the state. Sanctions have only exacerbated these problems, turning what was once the richest country in Latin America into a failed state. The US could push for a multilateral approach, one that includes the EU, Canada, and even regional players like Brazil and Mexico, to offer Venezuela a path to economic recovery in exchange for political reforms. This isn't about charity, it's about stability. A collapsed Venezuela is a haven for drug trafficking, migration crises, and geopolitical meddling. The US has a direct interest in preventing that outcome, even if it means swallowing its pride in talking to Maduro. Now, I can already hear the objections. But Maduro is a dictator. We can't reward bad behavior. What about human rights? These are all valid concerns, but they miss the bigger picture. The US has engaged with far worse actors when it suited its interests. Nixon went to China. Reagan negotiated with the Soviets. Obama struck a nuclear deal with Iran. None of these were about moral purity, they were about advancing US interests in a complex world. Venezuela is no different. The question isn't whether Maduro is a good guy, he's not, but whether the US can afford to keep pretending that isolation is a strategy. The grand strategy here isn't about Venezuela alone. It's about reasserting US influence in a region that's increasingly looking elsewhere for partners. The US doesn't need to dominate Latin America the way it did in the 20th century, but it does need to ensure that the region doesn't become a staging ground for its rivals. That means offering alternatives, not just threats. It means recognizing that in a world where China and Russia are willing to play the long game, the US can't afford to keep swinging for the fences with every crisis. Sometimes, the smart play is to take the single instead of the home run. Let me be, none of this is easy. Engaging with Maduro will be politically toxic in Washington, where Venezuela has become a partisan football. The left will accuse the US of abandoning democracy, while the right will scream appeasement. But leadership isn't about doing what's easy, it's about doing what's necessary. And right now, the necessary thing is to recognize that the old ways aren't working. The US can't afford to keep treating Venezuela as a sideshow when it's fast becoming a proxy battleground for the 21st century's great power competition. So where does that leave us? With a choice, as I said before, but also with a moment of reckoning. The US is at a crossroads, not just in Venezuela, but in how it projects power in a world where its dominance is no longer guaranteed. The question isn't whether Washington can afford to engage with Maduro. The question is whether it can afford not to. Because if the US keeps doubling down on a strategy that's failed for 2 decades, the only thing it will achieve is to hand the keys to Latin America to Beijing and Moscow. And that's a price no one should be willing to pay.